There is a particular cruelty to anxiety that people who do not live with it do not fully understand. It is not just that it is uncomfortable. Discomfort is manageable. Discomfort has edges you can feel and reason with and move through. What makes anxiety different is that it does not stay in its lane. It does not limit itself to the thing it started with. It spreads, it migrates, it finds its way into every quiet moment, every still hour, every space you created for rest. And it fills that space before rest has a chance to arrive. You lie down and the thoughts begin. You close your eyes and the chest tightens. You try to be present in a peaceful moment and anxiety reminds you of the 17 things that could go wrong, have gone wrong, are probably going wrong right now without your knowledge. And the cruelest part is this. The thing you need most in order to manage anxiety is rest. Rest restores the nervous system. Rest gives the body a chance to regulate, to recalibrate, to return to a baseline that makes everything else more manageable. And anxiety takes rest from you. Specifically, deliberately, relentlessly. It makes the one thing that would help the most, the one thing that feels the most impossible to access. If you are exhausted in a way that sleep does not fix, if you're tired not just in your body, but in your mind and your nervous system, and the part of you that has been on high alert for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to actually be at ease, I want you to stay with me today, because I want to talk about something that is deeper and more real than any of the advice you have probably already received. I want to talk about peace, not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of every problem, not the state you arrive at when everything is finally okay, the kind of peace that exists before all of that, the kind that does not make sense given the circumstances, the kind that passes understanding because it does not come from understanding. And I want to talk about how you actually find it when anxiety has been living in the space where peace is supposed to be. Let me start with something that most conversations about anxiety get wrong before they even get started. They treat anxiety like a problem to be solved. And I understand why. It presents like a problem. It has symptoms that are measurable. It responds to interventions. There are things you can do that make it better and things you can do that make it worse. And so the natural approach is to identify the right combination of strategies and apply them until the anxiety goes away. But anxiety is not primarily a problem to be solved. It is a signal to be understood. And there is a profound difference between those two approaches, and that difference determines almost everything about whether your relationship with anxiety changes or stays the same. When you treat anxiety as a problem to be solved, the goal becomes elimination. You want it gone. You want to stop feeling it. And every moment you are still feeling it becomes evidence that the solution is not working, which makes you more anxious about the anxiety, which is one of the more exhausting loops available to the human mind. The anxiety about the anxiety, the fear of the fear, the shame about still feeling this way when you have tried so many things. When you treat anxiety as a signal to be understood, the goal changes. You are no longer trying to make it stop. You are trying to understand what it is telling you, where it is coming from, what it is protecting you from, what it has learned to be afraid of, and why those lessons made sense at the time. They were learned, even if they are not serving you well now. That shift does not make anxiety immediately comfortable, but it changes your relationship with it in a way that is the beginning of something real, because you cannot find peace in the presence of something you are constantly at war with. And if anxiety is something you have been fighting, managing, suppressing, medicating away, distracting yourself from for years, the exhaustion of that war may be part of what is making the rest so impossible to find. I want to talk about what anxiety actually is at its most fundamental level, not the clinical description, the human one. Anxiety is the nervous system's response to perceived threat, and the key word in that sentence is perceived. Not actual, perceived, which means that the threat does not have to be real in order for the response to be completely real. It does not have to be present or imminent or even particularly likely. It just has to be possible. And for an anxious mind, possible is more than enough. Because the anxious mind is a prediction machine that has been calibrated toward danger. It scans the future for everything that could go wrong. It runs simulations of bad outcomes. It prepares you for disasters that have not happened and may never happen by putting your body in a state of readiness that is physiologically identical to the state you would be in if the disaster were actually unfolding right now. This is not a malfunction. It is the oldest and most reliable protection system the human body has. It kept people alive in environments where threats were constant and real, and not surviving the threat had permanent consequences. The problem is not that the system exists. The problem is that the system does not always know the difference between a predator in the immediate environment and a difficult conversation that is happening 2 weeks from now. It treats both with the same urgency, the same cortisol, the same elevated heart rate, the same narrowed field of attention, the same impossibility of rest. And when you live with that system chronically activated, when the alarm has been going off for so long that silence itself feels suspicious, your baseline shifts. You stop knowing what ease actually feels like because you have not been in it long enough to remember. You start to mistake the high alert for your normal. And then the peace, when it is offered to you in small moments, does not register as peace. It registers as the quiet before something bad happens. And the anxiety finds a way back in. Let me talk about the body before we talk about anything else. Because anxiety lives in the body first, and most approaches to it start too far upstream. When you are in an anxious state, your body is not in a neutral condition that your mind is then reading negatively. Your body is actively producing the experience of anxiety. The elevated heart rate, the shallow breathing, the muscle tension, the digestive disruption, the heightened startle response, the inability to sit still, the exhaustion that comes not from having done things, but from having been in a state of readiness for things that did not come. All of that is your body, running a program that was activated by something and generating a physical reality that your mind then reads and amplifies. And because most of us were never taught to work with the body directly, we try to think our way out of anxiety. We try to reason with it. We produce arguments for why the feared outcome is unlikely. We remind ourselves of all the times we worried about something that did not come to pass. We make lists and plans and contingencies, believing that if we can think through every possible scenario thoroughly enough, the anxiety will be satisfied and stand down. It does not work, not because the thinking is wrong, but because anxiety does not live in the thinking part of the brain. It lives in the part that is older than language, older than logic, older than the capacity for rational argument. And you cannot talk that part into standing down by making a good point. It does not care about good points, it cares about safety. And safety, for that part of the brain, is not established by argument. It is established by something the body experiences, not something the mind decides. This is why the most effective first responses to anxiety are physical. The breath, specifically, not deep breathing in the vague, cheerful way that people suggest it without explaining why. Deliberate, extended exhale breathing that directly signals the vagus nerve that the threat has passed and the parasympathetic system can begin to activate. The exhale is longer than the inhale, 4 counts in, 6 or 8 counts out. Not because it is a nice mindfulness practice, but because it is directly communicating with the part of the nervous system that controls whether your body stays in fight or flight or returns to a state where rest is physically possible. Movement, when anxiety is acute. Not intense exercise designed to exhaust yourself into calm, the kind of rhythmic bilateral movement that helps the nervous system process and discharge the activation energy that anxiety has generated. Walking, specifically, is one of the most reliably effective interventions available because the alternating left-right movement of the body while walking is one of the primary ways the nervous system processes unresolved activation. And temperature. Cold water on the face, or a cold shower, activates the dive reflex and slows the heart rate almost immediately. This is not a metaphor, it is physiology. And using physiology to address a physiological state is working with the problem at the level where the problem actually lives. I am not saying these things replace deeper work. They do not. But they are the beginning of being able to access the deeper work, because you cannot find peace while your nervous system is in full alarm. You have to get the body out of the alarm state first. And the body responds to body-level interventions before it responds to anything else. Now I want to talk about the mind, because once the body is given some relief, what happens in the mind matters enormously. The anxious mind has a specific set of patterns that it defaults to, and understanding those patterns is what allows you to work with them rather than simply being carried by them. The first pattern is catastrophizing, the automatic mental movement from something that is wrong or uncertain or uncomfortable to the worst possible version of what that thing could mean. The headache becomes a tumor. The difficult conversation becomes the end of the relationship. The financial strain becomes permanent poverty. The mistake at work becomes the beginning of a collapse that ends with losing everything. The catastrophizing happens fast, below the level of conscious choice, and by the time you notice it, you are already in the middle of the catastrophe that has not happened. The practice that addresses catastrophizing is not positive thinking. It is what psychologists call decatastrophizing, and it is more honest and more effective than the replacement of a dark thought with a bright one. It asks a specific question, not what is the best possible outcome, but what is the most likely outcome. Not what if everything goes wrong, but what is actually probable given what I actually know. And it asks a second question that is even more important. Even if the feared thing happened, then what? Not to minimize the fear, but to remind the mind that the worst case, should it actually occur, is something that can be survived and responded to. That there is a then what, that the story does not end at the feared outcome. The second pattern is the illusion of control. The anxious mind believes at some level that if it thinks about the thing hard enough and long enough and thoroughly enough, it can prevent the bad outcome. That the worrying itself is protective. That to stop worrying would be to become careless, to drop your guard, to invite the thing you are afraid of by failing to maintain adequate vigilance against it. This belief is one of the most important ones to examine, because it is the belief that makes anxiety feel not just uncomfortable, but necessary. And as long as anxiety feels necessary, you cannot let it go, because letting it go feels like becoming irresponsible, feels like carelessness, feels like inviting disaster rather than protecting against it. But the hard truth is that worrying about something does not prevent it. It does not change the probability of the outcome. It only changes your experience of the time between now and when the outcome is determined. And spending that time in a state of dread, running simulations of disaster, is not preparedness. It is suffering in advance of something that may never arrive. And it is buying that suffering with the only currency you actually have, which is the present moment. The third pattern is the narrowing of attention. Anxiety focuses your awareness the way a spotlight works. It illuminates the one thing that is wrong or uncertain or threatening, and it throws everything else into shadow. And in the light of that spotlight, the threatening thing looks enormous because it is filling the entire field of your attention. But the field itself is much larger than the spotlight is showing you. There are things in the shadow that are okay, that are even good, that are present and available and real. And anxiety makes them invisible. The practice of intentionally widening attention is not denial. It is accuracy. It is the correction of a perceptual distortion. Not pretending the difficult thing is not there, but refusing to let it be the only thing your awareness is allowed to touch. I want to spend time on sleep specifically because anxiety and sleep have a relationship that deserves its own careful attention. Sleep is where the nervous system does its most essential maintenance. It is where the day's experiences are processed and integrated, where the emotional weight of what happened gets sorted and filed in a way that makes it more manageable in the morning, where the body repairs itself and the mind restores itself and the entire system returns, ideally, to a baseline that makes the next day possible. And anxiety attacks sleep at every stage. At the entry point, making it impossible to fall asleep because the mind will not quiet. In the middle of the night, pulling you out of the deeper stages with a sudden awareness of something urgent that needs to be solved right now at 3 a.m. And at the exit point, making the early morning hours before you fully wake one of the most anxious times of the day, when the defenses are down and the thoughts arrive before you have had a chance to fortify yourself against them. The relationship between anxiety and sleep deprivation is one of the more vicious cycles available. Because sleep deprivation directly increases anxiety, the brain regions that regulate emotional response become less effective with poor sleep. The amygdala, which is the alarm center, becomes more reactive. The prefrontal cortex, which provides the capacity for reason and perspective, and the ability to recognize that the alarm is disproportionate, becomes less active. So the less you sleep because of the anxiety, the more anxious you become, which makes sleep harder, which increases the anxiety further. Understanding this cycle is important because it means that improving sleep is not just a comfort measure, it is an intervention in the anxiety itself, and there are things that can be done to create better conditions for sleep even before the anxiety is fully resolved. The hour before sleep matters more than most people treat it. The nervous system needs a transition period. It cannot go from full activation, screens, stimulation, news, problems, direct processing of stressful information, to sleep. The transition has to be created intentionally. Lower light, quieter sound, something that occupies the mind lightly without activating it. And the deliberate preparation of a space that the body associates with rest rather than wakefulness. What you do when you wake in the middle of the night matters. Getting up and going to another room is often more effective than staying in the bed fighting the sleeplessness, which trains the brain to associate the bed with wakefulness and anxiety. Writing down the thoughts rather than trying to resolve them can discharge some of the urgency. And the breath, again, returns the body to a state where sleep is physically possible even when the mind still wants to process. None of this solves anxiety, but all of it creates slightly better conditions. And in a chronic condition like anxiety, slightly better conditions compounded over time are not trivial. They are the slow accumulation of a different baseline. Let me talk about what peace actually is, because I think most people are looking for something that does not exist, and the search for that non-existent thing is part of what keeps the peace that does exist out of reach. Most people, when they imagine peace, imagine the absence of difficulty. They imagine a life from which the sources of anxiety have been removed, the health scare resolved, the financial pressure relieved, the relationship repaired, the uncertainty eliminated, the future made clear and manageable and safe. And in that imagined state of resolved circumstances, peace would naturally arrive. This is the peace that most people are waiting for, the peace that comes when things are okay. But that peace is contingent. It depends entirely on circumstances cooperating. And circumstances are not cooperative in the way we would need them to be in order for that kind of peace to be stable. Because as soon as one set of circumstances resolves, another set emerges. Because the future is never fully clear or fully safe. Because the nature of life in a world that we do not control means that the conditions required for contingent peace are never permanently met. The peace that passes understanding is a different category of thing entirely. It is the peace that exists, not because circumstances have resolved, but in spite of the fact that they have not. It is the peace that is present in the middle of the difficulty, the kind that sits alongside the grief and the uncertainty and the things that have not yet been figured out, and is genuinely real in spite of all of them. The kind that does not require the problems to be solved first before it is allowed to arrive. That peace is available, not as a constant unbroken state of blissful calm that eliminates all feeling, but as a ground, as a foundation that holds even when the surface is turbulent, as a quality of being that does not depend on your circumstances being arranged in the right order. And it cannot be manufactured. It cannot be thought into existence or performed into existence or achieved through sufficient effort. It is the kind of thing that arrives when you stop trying to create it through control and allow yourself to be present in the one moment that actually exists, which is this one. Let me talk about control, because anxiety and control are so intimately connected that you cannot fully address one without addressing the other. Anxiety is, at its core, a control response. It is what happens when the mind encounters something uncertain and responds with the attempt to think its way into certainty, to plan its way into safety, to worry its way into preparation so thorough that nothing can surprise it. And the attempt itself, however exhausting, provides a temporary sense of agency, the illusion that by thinking about the thing hard enough, you are doing something about it. The problem is that most of the things that generate the most anxiety are not within your control. Other people's choices, your health, the economy, the future in general, whether the thing you love survives, whether the people you love are okay. These are things where your influence is real but limited, and where the outcome is ultimately not in your hands. And anxiety, rather than accepting that limitation, responds to it by trying harder, by generating more worry, by running more simulations, by finding more angles to think from, as if the problem of uncontrollability can be solved by sufficient mental effort. As if, eventually, the worry will achieve a level of thoroughness that closes the gap between what you can control and what you cannot. It never does. And the exhaustion of trying is one of the most reliable sources of the kind of fatigue that sleep does not fix. The move that begins to change this is not the intellectual acceptance of uncontrollability. That is easy to say and almost impossible to genuinely enact through effort. The move is something quieter and more specific. It is the practice of redirecting your attention again and again from what you cannot control to what is actually in your hands in this moment. Not the whole future, not the resolved version of the problem, just what is available now. Just what can actually be done today. Just the next step, detached from the requirement that the next step guarantee the outcome. That redirection does not solve the uncontrollable things, but it stops spending the present moment on them in a way that has no return. And the accumulated effect of many small redirections over time is a different relationship with uncertainty. Not the absence of discomfort when the uncertain things arise, but a lessened compulsion to make them certain before you are willing to be at peace. I want to talk about the spiritual dimension of anxiety now, not to suggest that anxiety is a spiritual problem with a spiritual solution that bypasses everything else we have talked about. It is not. Anxiety is a full human problem that requires engagement at every level. But the spiritual dimension is real, and it is important, and it deserves honest attention. For many people who have a faith life, anxiety comes with an additional layer of pain that secular conversations about it miss entirely. The pain of believing that the anxiety itself is evidence of a faith problem. The belief that if you truly trusted, you would not be anxious. That the presence of the anxiety is a verdict on the quality of your relationship with God. That the people who do not struggle with anxiety the way you do have something you are missing. Some level of surrender, some depth of trust, some quality of faith that would, if you could develop it sufficiently, finally make the worry stop. And so you try harder spiritually, you pray more, you surrender more, you confess the anxiety as a failure of faith and commit to doing better, and the anxiety does not go away. And the failure of that spiritual effort to resolve the anxiety becomes its own source of shame, and the shame amplifies the anxiety, and you are now anxious and ashamed of being anxious and failing to resolve it spiritually and ashamed of that too. I want to dismantle that framework as directly and as gently as I can. Anxiety is not the opposite of faith. It is the experience of a human being whose nervous system is responding to perceived threat in the way human nervous systems are designed to respond. Some people's nervous systems are more sensitive than others by temperament, by genetics, by the experiences that shape them in their earliest years. None of that is a spiritual failure. None of it is a verdict on the quality of their trust. None of it means God is more distant from them than from the person next to them whose nervous system is calibrated differently. The people in history whose lives demonstrate the most profound depth of faith were not uniformly serene. Many of them wrote about their fear, their anguish, their moments of overwhelming dread, their dark nights of the soul when peace felt completely inaccessible. And those writings have endured not in spite of their honesty about the struggle, but because of it. Because the struggle is real for real human beings. And pretending it is not, in the name of faith, is not faithfulness. It is performance. What faith offers in the context of anxiety is not the elimination of the feeling. It is the reorientation of the attention in the middle of the feeling. It is the capacity to be in the anxiety and still be in the presence of something that is larger than the anxiety, to hold the fear and the trust at the same time. Not because the trust has cancelled out the fear, but because the trust is big enough to contain the fear without being destroyed by it. That is different from not being anxious, but it is also different from being alone in the anxiety. And for many people, the difference between those two things is the difference between the anxiety being survivable and the anxiety being overwhelming. Let me talk about what it means to be present when anxiety is pulling you somewhere else. Anxiety is almost entirely a future-oriented experience. It lives in the projected version of things that have not happened yet. It is almost never about the actual present moment. When you are in genuine immediate danger, the response is not anxiety. It is the acute, focused, action-oriented response of the threat being right here, right now. Anxiety is what happens when the brain projects a threat into a future moment and then responds to that projection as if it were present, which means that presence is one of the most direct antidotes to anxiety available. Not presence as a technique, not the kind of mindfulness that becomes another item on the performance checklist, but genuine presence, the real experience of being fully in this moment, with these senses, in this actual body, in this actual space, in this actual now, rather than in the projected version of a future that has not arrived. This is harder than it sounds, because the mind does not stay in the present without practice. It migrates naturally, especially an anxious mind, toward the future and its threats. And returning it to the present requires repeated, patient, gentle redirection. Not fighting the migration, not shaming yourself for having drifted again, just noticing the drift and returning. Just noticing the drift and returning, over and over, without frustration, without the expectation that you will stop drifting, with the steady, simple intention of returning one more time. The breath is the most reliable anchor for this because it is always happening in the present. You cannot breathe in the past or the future. The breath is only ever now. And using the breath as the returning point, the thing you come back to when you notice you have drifted into the projected threat, is one of the most practical and most powerful practices available to an anxious person. And over time, not immediately, not after one practice session, but over real accumulated time, the present moment starts to feel safer. The mind starts to gather evidence that being here, in this actual moment, is something it can survive. That the worst is almost never happening right now. That right now, most of the time, is somewhere where there is still something to stand on. I want to speak to the loneliness of anxiety, because it is one of the most isolating conditions available to a human being, and that isolation compounds everything else. Anxiety makes you feel different from other people in a specific way. You look around at the people in your life and they seem, from the outside, to be okay, to be navigating the same circumstances that are overwhelming you with something that looks like ease, or at least competence. And you cannot understand how they are doing it, what they have that you do not, how the things that stop you in your tracks barely seem to register for them. What you are seeing is not the full picture. Because everyone manages something, everyone carries something they do not fully show. The person who looks most at ease may be carrying their own weight in a different form, in a private space that you do not have access to. Anxiety is one of the most common human experiences available, and it is one of the most hidden, because showing it feels like weakness, because showing it feels like it will change how people see you, because showing it requires a vulnerability that anxiety itself, with all of its protective instincts, resists. And so, you carry it alone. And the loneliness of carrying it alone makes it heavier. And the heaviness makes the rest harder to access. And the exhaustion of the whole thing makes the isolation feel safer than the risk of being seen in it. If there is someone in your life who can know about this, not who you have to manage or perform okayness for, but who can be with you in it without flinching and without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it or remind you that it could be worse. That person is one of the most valuable things available to you in this season. The experience of being genuinely known in your struggle, without the struggle being used against you or treated as a problem that needs to be solved before the conversation can continue, is itself a form of healing. Not because talking about it eliminates it, but because being known in it eliminates the layer of shame that isolation adds on top. And if you do not have that person yet, if anxiety has convinced you that showing this to anyone would be too much, or would change how they see you in ways you cannot recover from, I want to gently challenge that, not recklessly, not with everyone, but with one person who has demonstrated, even in small ways, that they are the kind of person who can be trusted with the real version of things. Because the risk of being known in this is smaller than the cost of carrying it entirely alone. And the cost of carrying it entirely alone is already very high. Let me talk about the difference between anxious doing and grounded doing, because anxiety does not always look like paralysis. Sometimes it looks like productivity. There is a kind of doing that is driven by anxiety rather than by clear intention. It is the doing that cannot stop, because stopping would mean sitting with the feeling. The busyness that fills every quiet moment, because quiet moments are where the anxiety is loudest. The productivity that is actually avoidance dressed in the clothing of accomplishment. the constant motion that mistakes movement for progress and noise for peace. You can recognize anxious doing by what happens when you stop. If stopping immediately floods you with something that feels like danger or dread or an urgency to get back to the motion, that is the signal that the motion was serving the anxiety rather than serving your actual intentions. And the things produced by anxious doing often have a hollow quality. You did them, but you were not really there for them. They happened in the space where presence should have been, but was not. Grounded doing is different. It is action that emerges from a place that is connected to what actually matters. Action that can be paused without the world ending. Action that produces something that has the quality of presence in it because the person doing it was actually there. And grounded doing is available even to people with anxiety, but it requires first some access to the ground. And the ground is not a state of perfect calm. The ground is not the absence of anxiety. The ground is the thing underneath the anxiety that holds you even when the anxiety is loud. It is the part of you that is not the fear, the part that can observe the anxiety without being completely consumed by it. The part that knows, even in the middle of the worst anxious moment, that this has passed before, and that something in you has survived it, and that something is still here. Finding that ground is not an intellectual exercise. It is a practice, a repeated, patient, sometimes barely perceptible, returning to the part of you that is not the storm. And over time, that practice builds a relationship with the ground that the anxiety cannot fully sever. It becomes something you know how to find even when the finding is hard. I want to talk about the night specifically, because for many people with anxiety, the night is the hardest part. The night removes the distractions. The tasks that absorb attention during the day are gone. The social interactions that provide some external structure for the mind are over. The noise that fills the daylight hours goes quiet. And in that quiet, everything the noise was covering up becomes audible. The fears that were manageable in the context of activity become enormous in the context of stillness. The thoughts that could be deferred during productivity cannot be deferred when there is nowhere to defer them to. And the particular quality of night thoughts is different from day thoughts. They are less accurate, less proportionate, more catastrophic in their texture. Partly this is because the prefrontal cortex is less active at night, which means the moderating, perspective-giving, reason-providing part of the brain is less available to check the alarm center's conclusions. And partly it is because the body is at a low point in its cortisol cycle in the early hours of the morning, which means that the physiological support for resilience is reduced, which means that the conclusions you draw at 3 a.m. about the state of your life, your relationships, your future, your worth, those conclusions are being drawn by a brain that is operating on a reduced resource set and a heightened alarm system. They are not reliable. They are not the full picture. And treating them as definitive assessments of reality is one of the most common ways that anxiety maintains its grip through the night hours. The practice for the night is different from the practice for the day. During the day, you can engage, redirect, take action. At night, the most effective response is often not engagement, but acknowledgement and deferral. Noting the thought, not arguing with it, not trying to solve it, not spiraling into it, just noting it. This is the anxiety doing what it does at this hour. I am noting it. I am not solving it right now. There is nothing that can actually be resolved at this hour that cannot be more accurately and effectively engaged with in the morning. And returning, without frustration, to the breath, to the body in the bed, to the sounds that are actually present in the room, to the evidence that right now, in this actual moment, there is still a flaw. Let me speak to the season. Because anxiety does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context. And sometimes the context is one of genuine difficulty, genuine uncertainty, genuine threat that is not being manufactured by the mind, but is actually present in your life. And I want to be honest about that. Not everything that anxiety points to is a distortion. Some of what you are anxious about is real. Some of the things you are afraid of have genuine weight to them. Some of the uncertainty you are living in is actual uncertainty, not the projection of an overly activated nervous system, but the honest condition of a life that is in a genuinely hard place. In those seasons, the work is not to convince yourself that your anxiety is irrational. It is not. It is to separate the accurate signal from the amplification. to acknowledge the real difficulty without following anxiety into the worst possible version of what that difficulty might mean, to sit with genuine uncertainty without requiring it to resolve before you are willing to be present, to bring what is real to a place that is larger than what is real, and to let that larger presence hold some of the weight that you have been carrying alone. That is what it looks like to find peace that passes understanding in a genuinely hard season, not the peace of resolved circumstances, but the peace of a ground that holds even when the surface is genuinely turbulent, the peace of being carried even when you are too tired to carry yourself, the peace of company in the dark that does not require you to pretend the dark is not dark. That peace does not announce itself dramatically. It tends to arrive quietly, in a moment when you expected to be overwhelmed and found instead that something held, in a breath that went a little deeper than the one before it, in the surprising absence of dread in a moment where dread would have been entirely understandable, in the sense quiet and unexplainable that you are not as alone in this as the anxiety has been insisting. As we move toward the end of our time together, I want to speak to the long view, because anxiety is often not something that disappears completely. It is something that changes in its relationship to you. The volume changes, the frequency changes. The amount of your life that it occupies changes. The speed with which you can return to yourself after an anxious episode changes. The degree to which it controls your choices and limits your life and keeps you from the things and the people that matter to you changes. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. And it is what healing in this context actually looks like. Not the elimination of every anxious feeling, not the arrival at a permanent state of equanimity that is never disturbed, but the changing of your relationship with the anxiety from one of domination to one of navigation. From a relationship in which the anxiety is in the driver's seat and you are along for wherever it decides to take you, to one in which you are in the seat and the anxiety is a passenger whose presence you acknowledge without handing over the wheel. That change is possible. It is real. It happens for real people through real work over real time. Not overnight, not through a single breakthrough moment, through the accumulated effect of many small practices done imperfectly and consistently over a period of time. Through the willingness to engage with the anxiety rather than only avoid it. Through the building of a relationship with your own nervous system that is informed and patient and compassionate rather than frustrated and ashamed and at war. And through the willingness to receive help, whatever forms that takes, the body-level interventions, the therapeutic relationships that provide the kind of processing that cannot happen alone, the community that knows enough of the truth to provide real support rather than manage distance, and the spiritual practice that locates you in something larger than the anxiety, not as a bypass of the human experience of it, but as the ground beneath the human experience of it. Here is what I want to leave you with today. The anxiety that will not let you rest is not your enemy, even though it feels like one. It is a part of you that is trying, in the only way it knows how, to keep you safe. It learned something about what the world requires of you, and it has been faithfully applying that learning ever since, whether or not the learning is still accurate. And like any part of you that has been trying to help, it responds better to understanding than to warfare. You do not have to be at peace with everything in your life in order to find peace. You do not have to have it figured out. You do not have to have resolved the things that are genuinely uncertain, or fixed the things that are genuinely broken, or silenced the voice that keeps telling you what could go wrong. You just have to find the thing underneath all of that, the ground, the part that has been there the whole time, through every anxious night and every overwhelming day, holding you even when you did not know you were being held. That ground is not far away. It is not reserved for people whose faith is more mature or whose nervous systems are more cooperative or whose lives are more manageable. It is available right here, in this moment, to the version of you that exists right now. Anxious and tired and still here, still showing up, still asking the question of how to find peace when the anxiety will not let you rest. The asking is itself the beginning, because you would not be asking if you had completely given up. And you have not given up. Even on the days when it felt like you had, something in you kept going, kept breathing, kept returning to the possibility that something other than the anxiety is available, that something is real. and it is closer than the anxiety wants you to believe. And it does not wait for the anxiety to stop before it is willing to be found. You can find it in the next breath, in the decision to stay present in this moment instead of following the anxiety into the next one, in the quiet refusal to let the alarm be the only voice in the room, in the practice of returning again and again to the ground that has always been there. It is there, you are not too far from it, you are not too anxious to reach it, and it is holding you even now in the reaching. Rest is still possible for you, peace is still possible for you, not as a reward for finally getting the anxiety under control, but as a gift available in the middle of it. Receive it, one breath at a time, one present moment at a time, one quiet return to the ground at a time. That is enough. That is always enough.